Jack thought the Cascade blizzard would finally silence the ghosts of his past, until a black Mercedes skidded to a violent halt on the icy shoulder of Route 20. Through the swirling white, a man in a tailored coat and a woman in a striking crimson dress dragged a struggling German shepherd into the freezing night. They shoved the animal into a snowbank like discarded cargo, their cruel laughter echoing over the howling wind as they sped away into the dark. They had no idea they had just awakened a sleeping giant. Jack Sutherland wasn't just a witness. He was a Special Forces medic who had lost his entire unit to the flames of war, and he wasn't about to let another soldier die alone in the cold. But as he knelt over the shivering K9, he realized this was no ordinary abandonment. What he found hidden beneath the dog's tactical scars would expose a multi-million-dollar conspiracy that some were willing to kill to keep buried. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The snow fell like a heavy white curtain, threatening to erase the very road beneath Jack's tires. In the heart of the Cascade Mountains, the world felt hushed and sacred, a place where a man could disappear if he tried hard enough. Jack Sutherland moved through this frozen landscape with a weary, practiced alertness. At 38, he carried the warrior's stillness, a quiet intensity etched into his strong jawline and the faint scar crossing his left eyebrow. His hazel eyes scanned the treeline, a habit from 12 years as a combat medic that he could never quite turn off. Isolation was supposed to be his therapy, a way to outrun the survivor's guilt that followed him like a shadow. He didn't mind the biting cold, it was the only thing that felt honest anymore. The peace was shattered by the scream of tires and the glare of high beams. A black Mercedes SUV fishtailed across the road, stopping with a jerk that suggested panic or pure arrogance. The doors flung open and two figures emerged who looked like they belonged in a city gala, not a mountain storm. Brett Langford, sharp-featured in a wool coat, and Veronica St. Clair, her red dress a jarring bloodstain against the white snow. They wrestled a large German shepherd from the back seat. The dog fought with a desperate, silent dignity, claws scraping the frozen asphalt, until Brett delivered a final heavy shove. "Should have shot her, but this is cleaner," Brett snapped. Veronica's laughter was high and shrill, a sound devoid of mercy. As they tore away, leaving the dog to the mercy of the blizzard, something in Jack's chest, something he thought had died in Afghanistan, snapped back to life. Jack didn't think, he acted. He sprinted through knee-deep drifts, his medical kit swinging at his side. He found the dog, Nyx, collapsed and trembling, her dark coat already crusted with ice. As he knelt beside her, whispering the low, rhythmic comforts of a medic, her amber eyes locked onto his. There was no growl, no bared teeth, only the silent recognition between two soldiers who had seen the worst of the world. He slid his arms beneath her wasted frame, feeling the hard muscle of a K9 built for purpose and the thin, pale scars of an old IED blast. As he carried her toward the warmth of his truck, he noticed a flicker of light deep in the timber, not an engine but the brief, cold flash of a camera. They weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. Jack tightened his grip on the dog. The war he had tried to leave behind had just followed him home. The wind didn't just blow in the high Cascades. It screamed, a predatory howl that tore through the pines and rattled the windows of Jack Sutherland's aging Ford F-250. Outside, the world had dissolved into a frantic, swirling white abyss. It was the kind of storm that erased horizons and turned the familiar curves of Route 20 into a treacherous labyrinth of ice and shadow. For most, it was a nightmare to be avoided at all costs. For Jack, it was exactly what he had come for. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. At 38, his hands were steady, a medic's hands, built for the precision of a suture in a moving Humvee or the firm pressure on a femoral bleed. But inside, he felt like a machine with a cracked engine block, barely holding together. The counselor back at the VA had called it the survivor's burden, a clinical term for the ghosts of his unit that followed him into every room, every dream, and now into the mountains. He was driving toward a remote cabin he'd rented under a different name, a small wooden box at the edge of the world where he intended to spend a month in total silence. He wanted to see if the cold could finally numb the fire of the IED blast that still roared in his ears whenever the world got too quiet. Ahead, the red pinpricks of taillights flickered through the silver dust of the blizzard. Someone was driving too fast, the vehicle fishtailing with a reckless arrogance. Jack eased off the accelerator, his hazel eyes narrowing. He watched as the black Mercedes SUV ahead braked violently, its tires shrieking against the frozen asphalt before it lurched onto the shoulder. "Easy now," Jack muttered, his voice gravelly from days of disuse. He pulled his truck to a stop 50 yards back, the diesel engine rumbling like a low growl. He expected to see a driver checking a map or perhaps a mechanical failure. What he saw instead was a scene that felt like a jagged tear in the fabric of the mountain's sanctity. The driver's door flew open. A man stepped out, tall and angular, wrapped in a black wool coat that probably cost more than Jack's truck. His slicked-back hair was already being dusted with white as he moved with a sharp, irritated efficiency toward the rear passenger door. From the other side, a woman emerged, her presence a jarring strike of color against the monochromatic storm. She wore a striking crimson dress and heels, attire that belonged in a Seattle penthouse, not on a mountain pass in the middle of a gale. The man jerked the rear door open and reached inside. There was a struggle, a chaotic flurry of motion and a sharp, pained yelp that cut through the wind. They were dragging something out. Jack's pulse, usually a steady, slow rhythm, began to climb. He watched as the couple hauled a large German shepherd from the back seat. The dog fought back, its claws scraping desperately against the metal doorframe, its body twisting in a frantic attempt to stay inside the vehicle. The man's face was a mask of cold annoyance as he delivered a heavy, callous shove, sending the dog tumbling into the deep snowbank at the edge of the road. The woman didn't look away or offer a hand. She tilted her head back and laughed, a high, shrill sound that didn't belong anywhere near mercy. It was a sound of pure, detached cruelty. Should have shot her, but this is cleaner, the man snapped, his voice carrying on a sudden lull in the wind. He slammed the door shut. Without a backward glance, the couple climbed back into the Mercedes. The SUV's tires spun for a second, spraying slush and ice behind them, before they tore away into the darkness, their red taillights vanishing like two fading embers. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the whistling wind. The dog lay in the snow, a dark, motionless shape. In that moment, the man who had come to the mountains to disappear died, and the Special Forces combat medic was reborn. Jack didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh the risks or the cold. He kicked his door open, the wind nearly tearing it from his grip, and grabbed the heavy orange trauma bag from the passenger seat. "Hey!" he shouted, though he knew the Mercedes was long gone. He hit the snow running. The drifts were knee-deep, pulling at his boots, but he moved with a tactical grace born of 1,000 field drills. He reached the dog in seconds. She was a black and tan German shepherd, her coat matted with dirt and crusted with ice. She was lying on her side, her chest heaving in shallow, ragged hitches. Her muzzle was coated in frost, and her limbs were beginning to stiffen as the hypothermia set in. "Easy, easy," Jack said, his voice dropping into the low, rhythmic tone he used on the battlefield. "I've got you, soldier. Stay with me." As he knelt in the snow, the dog's head shifted. Her eyes, bright, intelligent amber, flicked up to his. There was fear there, yes, but beneath it was a profound, heartbreaking look of recognition. It was the look of a warrior who had been betrayed by her own. Jack's hands moved with practiced speed. He ripped open his bag, pulling out a mylar thermal blanket. He wrapped it around her shivering frame, tucking the edges beneath her to insulate her from the frozen ground. He felt for a pulse at her femoral artery. It was thready and slow, her heart struggling to pump thickened blood through her cooling veins. "You're not dying today," Jack whispered. "Not on my watch." He reached for a bag of saline, tucking it inside his own jacket against his skin to warm it slightly. He knew the risks of N4 in sub-zero temperatures, but her dehydration was severe and she needed the volume. As he prepped her leg, his fingers brushed against her ear. He paused. Inside the flap of her ear, etched into the skin in faded black ink, was a series of alphanumeric characters. A military tattoo. His eyes widened. He looked closer at her neck and shoulders. Hidden beneath the matted fur were the telltale calluses of a tactical harness and a jagged silver line of scar tissue running across her ribs, an old fragmentation wound. "You're a vet," Jack breathed, a sudden lump forming in his throat. "You served." The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just a discarded pet. This was a brother in arms. This dog had walked the same dust he had, heard the same explosions, and likely saved more lives than he could count. And those people in the Mercedes had thrown her away like trash. A cold, hard rage began to solidify in Jack's chest, replacing the hollow ache of his own trauma. It was a familiar feeling, the clarity of the mission. "Stay with me, soldier," he repeated, his voice firm. "That's an order." The dog let out a quiet, broken whine, her breath puffing in a tiny cloud of white. She didn't have the strength to lift her head, but she leaned it weakly against his knee, surrendering her life into his hands. Jack worked frantically. He knew he couldn't keep her here. The mountain was trying to reclaim her. He slid his arms under her body. She was heavier than she looked, all bone and wasted muscle, and stood. He trudged back to the truck, his lungs burning with the icy air, his boots slipping on the hidden ice beneath the snow. He managed to get the passenger door open and laid her across the seat. He climbed into the driver's side and cranked the heater to its maximum setting, the vents roaring with life. He stripped off his heavy canvas coat and draped it over the mylar blanket, then reached across to check her vitals again. Her shivering was violent now, a good sign meaning her body was still trying to fight. "We're going to Timber Ridge," Jack told her, shifting the truck into gear. "There's a vet there. A good one. You just keep breathing." As he drove, the blizzard seemed to intensify, the wind shaking the heavy Ford. Jack kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on the dog's shoulder, feeling the rhythmic tremor of her muscles. He watched the road with a quiet alertness he hadn't felt in a year. The warrior's stillness had returned, but it was no longer hollow. It had a purpose. Halfway down the pass, the dog shifted. She let out a long, heavy sigh and, with an effort that seemed to cost her everything, she moved her front paw. She rested it gently on Jack's forearm, her claws just barely catching the fabric of his sleeve. It wasn't a reflex. It was a gesture. A silent, weary thank you from one survivor to another. Jack felt something inside him, the thick, icy wall he'd built around his heart, start to crack. He had spent the last 12 months wishing he had died with his unit, wondering why he was the one who got to keep breathing while better men were buried in the dirt. He had wanted to disappear because he didn't think he had anything left to give. He looked at the dog, her amber eyes now closed, her breathing becoming deeper and more rhythmic as the warmth of the truck took hold. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. For the first time in a year, Jack Sutherland didn't want to disappear. For the first time in a year, he wanted something to survive. And as the lights of the small mountain town appeared through the whiteout conditions ahead, he knew that the couple in the Mercedes had made a catastrophic mistake. They thought they had disposed of a witness. They didn't realize they had given a broken medic a reason to fight again. The town of Timber Ridge was a jagged collection of cedar-shingled buildings clinging to the mountainside, looking like it had been dropped into the valley by a giant's hand and left to weather the ages. As Jack's truck rattled over the slush-covered main street, the town was little more than a ghost of itself, shrouded in the gray-white veil of the relentless storm. Street lamps flickered with a sickly yellow glow, and the only signs of life were the plumes of wood smoke struggling to rise from heavy stone chimneys. Jack didn't stop at the general store or the local diner. He steered the F-250 toward a small, sturdy structure on the edge of town with a sign that swung violently in the wind: Timber Ridge Veterinary and Wildlife Rescue. He killed the engine, but the silence that followed was far from peaceful. It was heavy with the sound of Nix's labored breathing. She hadn't moved since she'd rested her paw on his arm, but her eyes were open now, tracking him with a dull, glazed intensity. "Hang on, soldier," Jack whispered. "We're here." He didn't wait to see if the door was unlocked. He scooped the shepherd up, mylar blanket, canvas coat and all, and used his shoulder to barge through the front door. A bell chimed, a lonely sound in the sterile, quiet lobby. From the back of the clinic, a man emerged. He was in his late 50s, a tall African-American man with shoulders that seemed built to carry the weight of the world and hands that moved with a surgeon's steady grace. This was Dr. Marcus Webb. He took one look at Jack, covered in snow, eyes wild with a medic's hyperfocus, and then at the bundle in his arms. "Table 2, Marcus said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that bypassed pleasantries and went straight to the mission. "Now." Jack laid Nix down on the cold stainless steel. Marcus was already moving, snapping on gloves and reaching for a thermometer. Jack stood back, his hands hovering, still vibrating with the phantom adrenaline of the rescue. He watched Marcus work with a silent appreciation. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirrors of field hospitals from Jalalabad to Landstuhl. It was the look of a man who didn't see a patient. He saw a puzzle that needed to be solved before the clock ran out. "Hypothermic," Marcus grunted, reading the thermometer. "Heart rate is low but steadying. You did a hell of a job with that thermal wrap, son. Where'd you find her?" "Route 20. A couple in a black Mercedes tossed her into a drift like she was a bag of trash," Jack said, his voice tight. The woman laughed while she did it. Marcus's hands paused for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening. He didn't look up, but his tone darkened. "Some people don't deserve the air they breathe." He began a systematic exam, his fingers disappearing into the shepherd's thick, matted fur. "She's malnourished. Dehydrated. But look at these scars, Jack. He pointed to the silver lines Jack had seen earlier. These aren't from a fence or a dog fight. These are clean. Shrapnel. And look at the neck. The fur is worn down in a specific pattern. A tactical harness, Jack finished. Marcus nodded. He reached for a handheld scanner and ran it over the dog's shoulder. A sharp beep echoed in the small room. He turned to a computer terminal, his fingers flying across the keys as he accessed a secure database. For a few minutes, the only sound was the hum of the heater and the click-clack of the keyboard. "My God," Marcus whispered. Jack stepped closer, peering at the screen. A file appeared, topped by a photo of Nix in a desert environment, her ears perked, sitting proudly next to a young woman in desert camis. Service record, K9NYX, K142, Unit, 75th Ranger Regiment, K9 Core Specialty. Multi-purpose dog, explosives detection/tracking, handler, SGT Maria Gonzalez, Kia Cunar Province. Status, retired/transferred to private contract, missing/presumed deceased. "She's a decorated veteran," Marcus said, his voice thick with a mix of awe and anger. "It says here she found over 200 IEDs. She saved an entire convoy in 2022. Her handler, Sergeant Gonzalez, was killed in an ambush. Nix was wounded in the same blast, shielded a medic while he worked on Gonzalez. She was supposed to be in a specialized rehab facility in Virginia." Jack looked down at Nix. She was watching him, her ears twitching at the mention of her name. He felt a surge of kinship so strong it made his chest ache. She wasn't just a dog. She was a ranger. She had stood in the gap between life and death just like he had. "How did she end up with a couple in a Mercedes?" Jack asked. "The trail goes cold 18 months ago," Marcus replied, scrolling down. "She was adopted by a private security firm for consulting work. Apex Security Consulting. Run by a man named Brett Langford." The name tasted like ash in Jack's mouth. The man in the coat. The bell at the front door chimed again. This time it wasn't a desperate entrance. It was a deliberate one. A woman stepped in, shaking the snow from a green National Forest Service parka. She was Asian American, in her early 30s, with a face that looked like it was carved out of the mountain granite itself. This was Sarah Chin, the local wilderness ranger. Behind her followed a woman who looked entirely out of place in Timber Ridge, sharp gray suit, silver hair pulled into a tight bun, and eyes that missed nothing. "Marcus," Sarah said, nodding to the vet. She looked at Jack, her gaze lingering on his tactical boots and the way he stood, shoulders back, weight centered. "And you must be the one who called in the reckless driver report from the pass." "Jack Sutherland," Jack said. "This is Agent Rita Kozlov, FBI," Sarah said, gesturing to the silver-haired woman. "She's been cooling her heels at my station for 2 days waiting for a break in a case. When your description of the Mercedes came in, she nearly took the door off the hinges." Kozlov stepped forward, her eyes landing on Nix. She didn't look at the dog with pity. She looked at her with the intense focus of an investigator looking at a key piece of evidence. "That's her," Kozlov said. "That's the dog they've been using." "Using for what?" Jack asked, his hand instinctively moving to Nix's head. The dog leaned into his touch. "Brett Langford doesn't just run a security firm," Kozlov explained, her voice clipping each word. "He's a scavenger. He uses his government contacts to find where old military caches are buried, surplus, black market, you name it. But finding them in the mountains is hard. You need a specialist. Someone who can smell, see 4 through 6 feet of snow and 3 inches of steel." "Nix," Jack realized. "Exactly," Kozlov said. "She's been his consultant for a year. We believe she's led them to at least 4 illegal arms caches in the Cascades. But look at her. She's malnourished, injured. She probably stopped performing. And once a tool stops working for a man like Langford, he discards it," Jack finished, his voice a low growl. Suddenly Nix's ears swiveled. She let out a low, rumbling growl, not at the people in the room but at Sarah Chen's jacket. She tried to sit up, her muscles trembling, her nose twitching frantically. "Whoa, easy girl," Marcus said, trying to keep her on the table. "What is it?" Sarah asked, stepping back. Jack looked at the dog's behavior. "She's alerting." "Sarah, were you near the old mining district on your patrol today?" "Yeah, checking the perimeter near the North Ridge." "Why?" "Nix isn't growling at you," Jack said, his eyes widening. "She smells something on your coat. Marcus, scan her for residue." Marcus quickly grabbed a chemical swipe and ran it across the sleeve of Sarah's parka. He dropped the sample into a small portable analyzer. The machine whirred for 10 seconds before a red light flashed. Nitroglycerin and RDX, Marcus said, looking at the screen in disbelief. Military-grade explosives. I haven't been near any explosives, Sarah said, her face pale. You didn't have to be, Kozlov said, her voice grim. If you were walking the North Ridge, you were walking through the fallout of a cash move. Langford isn't just abandoning the dog. He's cleaning house. He's moving the inventory before we can serve the warrants. Jack looked at Nix. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on him now, as if she were trying to tell him something. She wasn't just a victim. She was the map. She knew exactly where Langford was going. She knew where the bodies, and the bombs, were buried. They didn't just toss her because she was broken, Jack said, the weight of the conspiracy settling over him. They tried to kill her because she's the only witness who can point to the exact locations of their smuggling ring. If she stays alive, Langford goes to prison for the rest of his life. And if he knows she's alive, Kozlov added, looking Jack dead in the eye, he's going to come back to finish the job. And he'll go through anyone standing in his way. Jack looked at the dog, then at the storm raging outside the window. He had come to these mountains to find a quiet place to die, or at least to stop feeling. But as he looked at Nix, a fellow soldier who had been betrayed by the country she served and the people who owned her, he felt a spark of something ancient and fierce. Let him come, Jack said softly. He reached down and gently took Nix's paw in his hand. She didn't pull away. First time in a year I've actually wanted something to survive, he whispered to Marcus. And I'm not letting them take her. Marcus looked at Jack, then at the FBI agent. He saw the shift in Jack's posture, the transition from a man in hiding to a man on a mission. You're going to need a place to lie low, Jack. Somewhere they won't look. I have the cabin, Jack said. It's remote. Defensible. I'll coordinate with the local sheriff, Sarah offered. But with this storm, backup is hours away if things go south. I don't need hours, Jack said, his hazel eyes turning as cold as the ice on the road. I just need a clear line of sight. He picked Nix up, her weight now a familiar, grounding presence. As he walked toward the door, he stopped by the computer and looked at the photo of Maria Gonzalez. I'll take it from here, Sergeant, he murmured. She's with the medic now. The drive back up to the cabin was a silent affair, save for the rhythmic thrum of the truck's tires over the deepening snow. Nix lay in the passenger seat, wrapped in a fresh wool blanket Marcus had provided. Her eyes were no longer glazed. They were wide and searching, following the sweep of the headlights across the skeletal pines. She was a professional on a new mission, her ears twitching at every shift in the wind, every snap of a frost-laden branch. Jack's rental cabin sat at the end of a long, unmaintained fire road that snaked into a box canyon. It was a rugged, one-room structure built of heavy cedar logs, weathered to a silver gray that blended perfectly with the winter landscape. As he pulled into the clearing, the cabin looked less like a retreat and more like an outpost. Home sweet home, soldier, Jack murmured, shifting the truck into park. He didn't just walk to the door. He scanned the perimeter first, the dark line of the tree-line, the pristine snow around the porch. Nothing. The blizzard was his ally for now, burying his tracks as quickly as he made them. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A twin-sized cot, a heavy oak table, and a cast-iron wood stove. On the table sat a few items that Jack had kept face down since his arrival. A framed photo of his unit in the Helmand province and his old service pistol. He set Nix down near the stove. The dog didn't immediately curl up. Despite her limp, she began a slow, methodical circuit of the room. She sniffed the corners, checked the back door, and finally took up a position by the front window where she had a clear sight line of the porch. Tactical positioning, Jack observed, his voice echoing in the small space. Old habits die hard, don't they? He began to work on the fire, the kindling catching with a cheerful crackle that felt out of place given the tension in his gut. As the heat began to seep into the room, Jack sat on the floor beside Nix. He didn't try to pet her yet, he knew better. He simply existed in her space, offering the quiet companionship of someone who understood that silence wasn't empty, it was often heavy with things that couldn't be said. I lost my team 3 years ago, Jack said softly, staring into the flames. An IED in a dry creek bed. I was the medic. I was supposed to fix them. But you can't fix a mountain falling on you. Nix turned her head, her amber eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire. She let out a soft whine, a sound of shared mourning. She shifted her weight, moving closer until her fur brushed against Jack's shoulder. The contact was electric. The first time Jack had allowed himself to be touched by a living soul without the barrier of a latex glove or a professional distance. As the night deepened, the storm began to break. The clouds parted to reveal a moon so bright it turned the snow-covered forest into a landscape of silver and ink. It was beautiful and it was dangerous. Visibility was no longer zero. Jack was boiling water for coffee when Nick suddenly stood. Her hackles didn't just rise. She let out a low, vibrating growl that Jack felt in his own chest. It wasn't the warning of a pet. It was the alert of a sentry. "What is it, girl?" Jack whispered, reaching for his pistol. He moved to the window, staying in the shadows. Outside, the world was still. Then he saw it. A mile down the ridge, far from any established road, a pair of lights flickered through the trees. They weren't the sweeping beams of a vehicle on a highway. They were narrow, focused, and moving with a slow, predatory deliberation. Jack grabbed his binoculars. Through the high-powered glass, he caught a glimpse of a black SUV, the Mercedes, parked on a logging trail that shouldn't have been passable in this weather. Two figures stood outside the vehicle. Even from this distance, the silhouette of Brett Langford was unmistakable, tall, rigid, and entirely out of place in the wilderness. He was holding something up to his eyes. A thermal imager. "They're scanning the ridge," Jack realized, his blood turning to ice. "They're looking for our heat signature." The lights vanished as quickly as they had appeared, but the silence that followed was different now. It was charged. Nix moved to the door, her nose working the air beneath the frame. She gave 4 sharp, rhythmic barks, the military alert pattern for explosives detection. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. They aren't just looking, Nix. They're marking. Jack knew he couldn't stay in the cabin if they had thermal. The heavy logs offered some protection, but the windows were a death trap. He began to move with the fluid efficiency of a soldier preparing for a breach. He packed a small rucksack, medical supplies, extra magazines, a thermal shroud, and Nix's medication. He looked at the dog. She was watching him, her ears forward, waiting for the command. "We aren't waiting for them to knock," Jack said, his voice cold and certain. "If they want a war, we'll give them one. But we play by my rules." He grabbed a piece of charcoal from the stove and wrote a single word on the oak table, knowing Sarah or Kozlov might find it if he didn't make it back. Redesign. It was a term from his unit, a signal that the original plan was compromised and they were moving to an alternate extraction point. As they stepped out into the freezing night, Jack felt a strange sense of peace. The ghosts of the Hellman province were still there, but for the first time they weren't chasing him. They were standing behind him, watching as he and a broken K9 disappeared into the shadows of the pines, turning the hunted into the hunter. The wind picked up again, erasing their footprints as they vanished into the tree line. In the distance, the faint, high-pitched whine of a drone began to buzz over the valley, the sound of the modern predator. The battle for Nix's life hadn't just begun. It had moved into the dark. The transition from the warmth of the cabin to the sub-zero bite of the night was like a physical blow. Jack and Nix moved as a single shadow, skirting the edge of the clearing and sticking to the deep cover of the ancient hemlocks. Jack had draped a specialized thermal reflective shroud over his pack and Nix's flank, a piece of gear he'd kept from his service days, designed to mask heat signatures from overhead drones. They were 50 yards into the tree line when the first sign of the breach occurred. A dull, heavy thud echoed through the canyon, the sound of a door being kicked off its hinges. Then the shattering of glass. Jack knelt behind the massive trunk of a fallen cedar, pressing his hand into the snow to steady himself. Beside him, Nix went low, her body vibrating with a suppressed growl. She didn't bark. She knew the value of silence in the kill zone. Through the trees, Jack watched 3 figures move with practiced tactical precision toward his cabin. They weren't mountain locals. They moved like contractors. Tight formations, suppressed short-barreled rifles, and night vision optics glowing like green insect eyes on their helmets. Brett Langford stood in the center of the clearing, his expensive black coat flapping in the wind. He didn't carry a rifle. He carried a tablet, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. "Clear," a voice called out from inside the cabin. Langford stepped onto the porch, his voice cutting through the freezing air with a jagged, arrogant edge. "Sutherland, I know you're out there. I saw the heat signature from the drone 5 minutes ago. You're a medic, not a ghost. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jack remained motionless. He was counting. 3 men in the cabin, 1 on the porch with Langford. 5 total. "The dog is proprietary hardware, Jack," Langford shouted, his tone shifting from reason to predatory. "She's worth $200,000 to my investors, and I'm not walking away from that kind of loss. Give her back, and I'll leave you to your little mountain exile. Keep her, and you're just another casualty of a bad winter." Beside Jack, Nix's ears swiveled toward the cabin. She looked at Jack, her amber eyes reflecting the moonlight. She knew the voice. This was the man who had starved her, beaten her, and eventually tried to freeze her to death. Her lip curled, revealing a flash of white teeth. "He's stalling," Jack whispered into Nix's ear. "He wants me to talk so he can triangulate our position." Veronica St. Clair stepped out of the shadows near the Mercedes, which had crawled up the fire road with its lights extinguished. She was still in that striking crimson dress, now draped in a heavy fur coat. She looked like a vulture perched on the edge of a grave. "Jack, honey," she called out, her voice a mocking lilt that set Jack's teeth on edge. "We know about the VA reports. We know you're broken. Why die for a dog that's going to be dead in a week anyway? She's a tool. A broken hammer. Let her go." A flare hissed into the sky, bursting in a blinding magnesium white that turned the forest into a high-contrast nightmare of long shadows and harsh light. "Flush them out," Langford commanded. The men began to fan out into the tree line, moving in a sweeping arc designed to pin Jack against the sheer rock face of the box canyon. They were using flashlights now, the beams slicing through the pines like lightsabers. Jack didn't retreat. He hadn't survived 12 years of combat by running from bullies. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small, palm-sized device, a tactical distraction charge he'd rigged from the emergency flares in his truck and a handful of black powder from his cabin's hearth. "Nix, flank left," he signaled with a hand gesture. The dog moved instantly, her training overriding her injury. She disappeared into the brush, a ghost in the snow. Jack waited until the lead contractor was within 20 feet of his position. He threw the charge toward the cabin's woodpile. Crack-boom. The explosion wasn't enough to kill, but the flash was deafening in the quiet canyon. The contractors instinctively turned toward the noise, their rifles tracking the smoke. In that split second, Jack moved. He didn't use his gun, not yet. He lunged from the shadows, hitting the lead man with the force of a freight train. He drove his knee into the man's solar plexus and used a redirected momentum to send him spiraling into a jagged outcrop of rock. At the same moment, a scream tore through the night from the opposite side of the clearing. Nix had emerged from the shadows like a vengeful spirit, her jaws locking onto the arm of the second contractor. The man went down, his rifle firing a wild burst into the treetops. "Get the dog," Langford screamed, panicking as his controlled environment descended into chaos. "Nix, heel," Jack roared. The dog released the man and sprinted toward Jack. They didn't stay to fight the remaining three. Jack knew the math, he was outnumbered and outgunned. He grabbed a handful of Nix's scruff to help her over a fallen log and dove into a narrow ravine that led deeper into the devil's throat, a labyrinth of ice-slicked stone and dense thicket where drones couldn't follow. Bullets hissed through the needles above them, snapping branches and sending showers of snow down onto their heads. "They're coming," Veronica's voice echoed, no longer mocking, but shrill with a growing desperation. Jack and Nix scrambled up the far side of the ravine, their breath coming in short, sharp bursts. They reached a high ledge overlooking the cabin. Below, Langford stood by the Mercedes, his silhouette shaking with rage as his men struggled to regroup in the snow. Jack looked down at Nix. Her side was heaving, and a small trickle of blood ran from where a branch had caught her ear, but her eyes were bright. She looked at him, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of something that wasn't just survival. It was triumph. "They think we're hiding, Nix," Jack whispered, checking the magazine of his service pistol. "But they've forgotten one thing." He looked at the tactical markings on her ear, then at the mercenaries below who were now shivering in the rising wind. "They're in our world now. And in this world, the medic decides who lives." As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of a second, even colder front, Jack saw the Mercedes start its engine. They weren't leaving. They were heading toward the mining district. The game of cat and mouse was over. The hunt had begun. The Devil's Throat lived up to its name. The narrow pass was a jagged gullet of granite and ice that funneled the mountain winds into a piercing whistle. Jack and Nix moved through the shadows of the north ridge, staying high above the valley floor. Jack's lungs burned, each breath felt like swallowing needles, but his focus was absolute. Beside him, Nix moved with a stiff-legged grace. The adrenaline of the skirmish at the cabin had masked her pain, but Jack could see the way she favored her hind leg. "Almost there, girl," he whispered, his hand momentarily resting on her head. They reached the crest of a ridge overlooking the old silver basin. Below them lay the remains of the Blackwood mining facility, a skeletal complex of rusted corrugated steel, rotting timber head frames, and abandoned warehouses. It was a place the world had forgotten in the 1940s, but tonight, it was pulsing with a sinister new life. Through his binoculars, Jack scanned the facility. The black Mercedes was parked near a massive, reinforced warehouse at the center of the yard. 3 heavy-duty flatbed trucks were lined up nearby, their engines idling, sending thick plumes of diesel exhaust into the moonlight. Men in tactical gear, the same contractors from the cabin, were moving crates with a forklift. These weren't wooden crates of old mining equipment. They were olive-drab Pelican cases, reinforced with steel bands and marked with international shipping codes. "That's enough hardware to start a small war," Jack muttered. He watched as Brett Langford emerged from the warehouse, gesturing sharply to the lead driver. Veronica followed, wrapped in her fur, her face a mask of cold impatience. She looked at her watch, then back at the dark mountain road. They were on a deadline. Nix's reaction was immediate. Her body went rigid, her tail tucked low, and a low, vibrating hum started in her throat. She wasn't just alerting, she was remembering. This was the place where she had been kept in a cage, the place where her training had been exploited to build this empire of iron. "We're going in," Jack said, his voice a ghost of a sound. They descended the ridge, using the cover of the rusted ore carts and the hulking remains of the processing plant. Jack moved with the silence of a man who had spent a decade navigating minefields. He watched the sentries, 2 men on the perimeter, 1 on the roof of the main office. They were overconfident, their eyes focused on the warm cabs of the trucks rather than the frozen darkness of the woods. They reached the side of the main warehouse. A heavy steel door was locked with a modern keypad, a jarring piece of technology in this graveyard of rust. Jack didn't try to hack it. He looked up, spotting a high clear-story window that had been shattered decades ago. "Nix, wait," he signaled. He climbed a rusted fire escape, the metal groaning under his weight, and pulled himself through the window. Inside, the warehouse smelled of cosmoline, grease, and ozone. He dropped silently onto a stack of pallets and moved to the side door, disengaging the manual override. Nix slipped inside, her paws clicking softly on the concrete. Immediately, her nose went to the air. She didn't hesitate. She led Jack past rows of crates, moving deeper into the bowels of the facility where the shadows were thickest. They reached a partitioned area in the back, hidden behind heavy canvas tarps. Jack pulled back a corner and felt his stomach drop. Row after row of man-portable air defense systems, manpads, sat on custom racks. Next to them were crates of thermobaric grenades and high-yield plastic explosives. This wasn't just a black market find. This was a strategic stockpile of military-grade ordnance stolen from government shipments. "My God," Jack breathed. "They've been using you to sweep the old Cold War bunkers, haven't they, Nix?" Nix didn't answer. She had stopped in front of a heavy iron grate in the floor, the entrance to an old ventilation shaft. She gave 4 sharp, rhythmic barks, then sat. "Explosives?" Jack knelt and shone his light through the grate. Below, he saw a tangled web of wires and a series of blocks marked with the same RDX residue Marcus had found on Sarah's jacket. The entire warehouse was wired. "Insurance?" Jack whispered. "If the feds show up, Langford burns the evidence and the mountain with it." A sudden heavy thud reverberated from the front of the warehouse. "He's early." Brett's voice echoed through the vast space. "Get the final shipment loaded. I want the trucks moving in 5 minutes." Jack peeked through the tarps. The warehouse doors rolled open and a second vehicle, a dark gray sedan, pulled in. A man in a high-collared coat stepped out, speaking in an accent Jack recognized from his time in Eastern Europe. The buyers had arrived. But it was what came next that froze Jack's blood. 2 contractors dragged a woman into the center of the light. Her hands were zip-tied, her face bruised. It was Agent Rita Kozlov. "I told you the FBI was sniffing around, Brett," Veronica said, her voice dripping with venom as she paced around the captured agent. "She was trying to plant a tracker on the Mercedes at the diner." Langford walked up to Kozlov, his face twisted in a cold, murderous smile. "You've caused a lot of trouble for a dead-end case, Agent. But you're just in time for the grand finale." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote. He held it up, the red LED blinking like a malevolent eye. "As soon as my trucks clear the pass, this place becomes a crater. And you're going to be the only witness left behind." Jack looked at Nix. The dog's eyes were locked on Kozlov, her protective instincts warring with the trauma of her past. Jack reached for his pistol, but he knew a firefight in a room filled with high explosives was a death sentence for everyone. He looked back at the ventilation grate where Nix was sitting. "Nix," Jack whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the gamble. "Can you find the master detonator? Can you find the heart of it?" The dog looked at the grate, then at Jack. She didn't hesitate. She slipped through a gap in the canvas, disappearing into the dark, rusted labyrinth beneath the floor. Jack stood up, checking his watch. He had 60 seconds before the truck started moving. He adjusted his grip on his weapon and stepped out from behind the tarp, his shadow stretching long across the concrete floor. "The party's over, Langford," Jack called out, his voice steady as a heartbeat. Every rifle in the room snapped toward him. The warehouse went deathly silent, the only sound the low, rhythmic thrum of the idling truck engines. Jack stood in the center of the aisle, silhouetted by the dim overhead amber lights. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had walked through hell and no longer feared the heat. "Sutherland," Langford spat, his surprise quickly curdling into a sneer. "I should have known you were too stubborn to die in the snow. Where's the dog?" "She's somewhere you can't reach her, Brett," Jack said, his hands held out away from his sides, though his fingers were inches from the grip of his service pistol. "And she's doing exactly what she was trained to do." The contractors shifted, their laser sights dancing across Jack's chest like tiny red fireflies. Agent Kozlov, her lip bleeding, looked up at Jack with a mix of shock and a silent, desperate plea. "Kill him," Veronica hissed, her face contorted. "Kill him now." "Wait," Langford commanded, holding up the black detonator. "He's got something. Don't you, Jack? You're a medic. You don't commit suicide unless you have a play." "The play is simple," Jack said, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. "The FBI is 10 minutes out. Sarah Chin has the coordinates. You can kill me, you can kill Agent Kozlov, but you're not getting those trucks out of the valley. And if you press that button, you're just executing yourself." Langford's thumb hovered over the red trigger. "I'll take my chances. My investors don't like witnesses." Below the floorboards, a faint rhythmic thump-thump-thump sounded. It was a sound only Jack recognized, the sound of Nix's tail hitting the side of a metal duct. A signal. She had found the primary receiver. "Now, Nix," Jack roared. From a ventilation grate directly beneath the buyer's feet, a flashbang grenade, one Jack had swiped from the crates earlier, exploded with a bone-shaking crack. The warehouse erupted into a cacophony of white light and deafening noise. The buyers screamed, clutching their eyes. The contractors, momentarily disoriented, fired blindly. Jack didn't waste a second. He drew his pistol and fired 3 precise shots, taking out the overhead lights and plunging the warehouse into a strobe-lit nightmare. He dove behind a stack of Pelican cases, moving toward Kozlov. "Nix, secure the asset." The German shepherd exploded from the shadows. She didn't go for the men with guns, she went for Langford's hand. Her jaws clamped onto his wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. Langford screamed, the detonator clattering to the concrete. Jack reached Kozlov, slicing her zip ties with a combat knife. "Can you run?" "Give me a gun," she gasped, her eyes hard as flint. Jack handed her his backup piece just as the lead contractor recovered. A hail of bullets shredded the crates above their heads, sending splinters of plastic and foam raining down. "The detonator!" Veronica screamed, lunging for the black remote. She grabbed it, her eyes manic. "If I'm going down, we all go." She pressed the button. A low, electronic hum filled the warehouse, followed by a mechanical click-clack from the walls. A digital timer on the main support pillar flared to life, glowing a toxic red. 2 o'clock. "It's a dead man's delay," Kozlov shouted over the gunfire. "We have 2 minutes. Get to the trucks." Langford yelled, nursing his mangled wrist as he scrambled toward the Mercedes. The warehouse turned into a frantic scramble for the exits. The buyers fled into the night, their sedan fishtailing out the bay doors. The contractors followed, abandoning their employers in the face of the impending blast. Jack looked at the timer. 1:40. "Kozlov, get to the perimeter. Find cover." "What about you?" "Nix is still in the ducts. I'm not leaving her." Jack sprinted toward the ventilation grate. He could hear Nix whining below. Her tactical harness had snagged on a jagged piece of rebar in the narrow shaft. She was trapped right next to the primary blasting cap. Jack dropped to his knees, reaching into the dark hole. "Easy, girl. Easy." He could see the bomb. It was a sophisticated piece of work, a C4 block wired to a cellular trigger. The timer on the wall was mirrored on the bomb's small LCD screen. 0:55. He reached down, his fingers fumbling with the heavy steel rebar. Nix was panting, her amber eyes fixed on his. She knew. She knew exactly what was about to happen. She gave a small, mournful lick to his hand, a soldier's farewell. "No," Jack grunted, his muscles straining as he tried to bend the metal. "Not today." He used his combat knife as a lever, putting every ounce of his survivor's rage into the movement. With a screech of protesting metal, the rebar gave way. He hauled Nix upward, her fur slick with oil and sweat, just as the timer hit 0:20. Run! They sprinted for the rear loading dock. Outside, the Mercedes was roaring toward the gate. But the ice was a fickle mistress. Langford, blinded by panic, hit a patch of black ice near the old headframe. The SUV spun wildly, slamming into a rusted car and pinning the driver's side door shut. Jack and Nix dove over the edge of the loading dock into a deep ravine of snow just as the world turned to white. The explosion was a physical force that flattened the trees for 100 yards. A pillar of orange fire roped into the night sky, turning the blizzard into a rain of golden ash. The shockwave rolled over Jack, burying him and Nix deeper into the snow. Silence followed, a ringing, absolute silence. Jack pushed his way out of the drift, gasping for air. He looked up. The warehouse was a blackened skeleton of twisted steel. The trucks were burning husks. A few yards away, the Mercedes was a crumpled wreck, its horn a continuous, dying wail. Brett Langford was crawling through the shattered windshield, his face a mask of blood and soot. Veronica stood nearby, staring at the ruin of their empire, her crimson dress tattered and black. Nix emerged from the snow beside Jack. She didn't bark. She stood tall, her ears forward, watching as the blue and red lights of the authorities finally crest the ridge. Jack walked toward Langford. The man looked up, his eyes wide with a pathetic, crawling fear. "Help me," Langford wheezed. "You're a medic, you have to." Jack looked at him, then at Nix, who stood at his side, a living testament to everything Langford had tried to destroy. He reached into his kit, pulled out a single roll of gauze, and tossed it into the snow at Langford's feet. "I'm a medic for soldiers," Jack said, his voice as cold as the mountain wind. "And I don't see any soldiers here." He turned his back on the flames, his hand resting on Nix's head. As the FBI and Sarah Chen's rangers swarmed the yard, Jack didn't look back. For the first time in years, the fire behind him wasn't the one in his nightmares. It was the one that had finally cleared the path home. The morning after the inferno at the Silver Basin, the Cascades were unervingly still. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world of blinding white purity and a sky the color of a robin's egg. In the valley below, the blackened skeleton of the warehouse still smoldered, a dark scar on the pristine landscape, but up at the Timber Ridge Clinic, the air smelled of floor wax, antiseptic, and hope. Jack sat in the small, sun-drenched waiting room, his hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug of coffee. He was battered. His face was a map of small cuts from flying glass, and his ribs ached with every breath, but he was clean. He had scrubbed the soot of the explosion from his skin, yet he couldn't quite shake the adrenaline that hummed in his marrow. Dr. Marcus Webb stepped out from the back, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright. "She's sleeping," Marcus said, pulling up a chair opposite Jack. "I pulled a few more shards of metal out of her shoulder, and that hind leg is going to need a long time to heal properly, but Nix is a fighter. She's already tried to get off the table twice to find you." Jack let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since he first saw those Mercedes headlights on Route 20. "She doesn't know how to quit, Marcus. It's not in her DNA." Marcus reached down to a leather satchel at his feet and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Agent Kozlov sent this over an hour ago. She's still at the hospital in the city getting her shoulder looked at, but she wanted you to have the full picture. The real picture." Jack opened the folder. On top was a photograph that made his throat tighten. It wasn't a tactical shot or a surveillance image. It was a candid photo taken in the harsh, golden light of an Afghan sunset. A young woman with a vibrant, defiant smile and deep brown eyes had her arms slung over the neck of a younger, leaner Nix. "Sergeant Maria Gonzalez," Jack whispered, reading the name on the back. As he flipped through the pages, the story of a hero unfolded. He read the citation for the Bronze Star with Valor. He read the accounts from soldiers in the 75th Ranger Regiment who described how Maria and Nix had led a foot patrol through a valley so thick with IEDs it was called the Devil's Garden. They had cleared a path for 23 men, detecting pressure plates hidden beneath rocks and wires woven into the very brush. "Final mission report," Jack muttered, his eyes scanning the technical military prose. The report described an ambush, a complex attack. Maria had been hit in the initial volley. Despite her wounds, she had used her body to shield a younger private while Nix kept the insurgents at bay, refusing to leave Maria's side even as the RPGs turned the ground to glass. When the medevac finally arrived, the recovery team had to physically restrain Nix to get Maria onto the bird. Maria Gonzalez had died on the flight to Bugram. Nix had been sent back to a stateside kennel, where her grief was mislabeled as aggression issues, making her the perfect target for a man like Brett Langford to acquire through a corrupt contractor link. She wasn't a tool that stopped working, Jack said, his voice cracking. She was a soldier who lost her heart and they tried to use the pieces. There's one more thing, Marcus said gently. Kozlov tracked down Maria's family. They're in Las Cruces, New Mexico. They've been looking for Nix for 18 months. They were told she was euthanized due to her injuries. Jack looked at the phone in his pocket. He hated phones. He hated the way they brought the world into his silence. But he looked at the photo of Maria, then through the glass door at Nix, who was twitching in her sleep, dreaming of a war that was finally over. Do it, Jack, Marcus urged. They need to know. Jack dialed the number provided in the file. It rang 3 times before the screen flickered to life. An older woman appeared, her face lined with the kind of elegant sorrow that only comes from outliving a child. Behind her, a younger man in a Marine Corps desert utility uniform stood with his hand on her shoulder. Hello, the woman said, her voice hesitant. Mrs. Gonzalez? Jack asked, straightening his posture. My name is Jack Sutherland. I'm a friend of your daughter's partner. The woman's hand went to her mouth. The young man leaned in, his eyes narrowing. What partner? Maria's unit is back in Georgia. Jack didn't say a word. He stood up and walked into the recovery room. He positioned the phone so the camera was aimed directly at the large, snoring German shepherd on the padded mat. A gasp echoed through the tiny speaker, a sound so raw it felt like it had traveled across 1,000 miles of static and pain. Nix, the woman sobbed. Oh, Dios mío. Nix. At the sound of the name, the specific lilt of a voice that sounded so much like the handler she had lost, Nix's eyes snapped open. She didn't growl. She didn't bark. She lifted her head, her ears swiveling toward the phone. She let out a soft, high-pitched whimper, her tail giving a single weak thump against the floor. She's alive, Jack said, his own eyes blurring. She's safe. And she's a hero, Mrs. Gonzalez. She saved an FBI agent and stopped a shipment of weapons that would have killed a lot of people. The young Marine, Maria's brother, looked at Jack. He saw the scars on Jack's face, the way he held himself, and the unspoken weight in his hazel eyes. He recognized a fellow traveler. Thank you, Sergeant, the Marine said, his voice thick. My sister. She loved that dog more than anything. She wrote in her journal that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped Nix would find someone who understood what it meant to stand the watch. Someone who wouldn't give up on her. I think she found him, Mrs. Gonzalez whispered, wiping her eyes. Please, you keep her, Mr. Sutherland. We have no way to care for a dog like that in the city. Maria would want her to be with a warrior. She would want her to be with you. Jack looked down at Nix. The dog had crawled off her mat and was now resting her chin on Jack's boot, her amber eyes fixed on his face with an unwavering, soul-deep loyalty. I'll take care of her, Jack promised. I'll make sure she never spends another night in the cold. After the call ended, Jack stayed on the floor with Nix for a long time. The clinic was quiet. The ghosts of the Hellman province were there, but they weren't screaming anymore. They were just there. Part of the landscape like the mountains outside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object Marcus had found in the debris of the warehouse. A charred, bent metal tag. It was Maria Gonzalez's PII tag, the one Nix had likely carried in her harness until the end. Jack took his own dog tags from around his neck and slid Maria's tag onto the chain alongside his. We're the second command now, Nix, Jack whispered, rubbing the dog's soft ears. The ones who are left. The ones who keep going. Nix sighed deeply, a long, rattling breath that seemed to release 2 years of trauma, cages, and ice. She closed her eyes and for the first time in Jack's presence, she truly fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Jack looked out the window at the snow-capped peaks. He had come here to disappear, to let the fire in his mind burn itself out in the cold. But as he watched the sun reflect off the ice, he realized that the fire hadn't gone out. It had changed. It was no longer a destructive roar. It was a steady, warm hearth. He didn't want to be a ghost anymore. He wanted to be the man Maria Gonzalez's mother saw. He wanted to be the man Nix thought he was. Spring in the Cascade Mountains was not a gentle arrival. It was a violent, beautiful rebirth. The white silence of the winter was shattered by the roar of the thaw as snowmelt transformed trickling streams into rushing, crystalline torrents. The scent of frozen pine was replaced by the heady, sweet aroma of damp earth and the first emergence of wild lupin. For Jack Sutherland, the change in the landscape was a mirror to the tectonic shifts occurring within his own soul. He stood on the wide, cedar-planked porch of the main lodge, his boots rooted firmly in the present. In front of him, the clearing that had once been a site of isolation was now the heartbeat of a new mission. A hand-carved sign hung over the entrance to the training grounds, the wood dark and sturdy, Second Command, where warriors heal together. The facility was a testament to what happens when a community refuses to let its heroes fall through the cracks. It wasn't a cold, clinical institution. It was a sanctuary built from the very bones of the mountain. There were 3 main wooden buildings: a lodge for communal living, a specialized kennel facility with heated floors and outdoor runs, and a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic. The realization of this dream hadn't been a solitary journey. Sarah Chin had navigated the labyrinth of the National Forest Service to secure a long-term land lease, arguing that the program provided a vital service to the region's veterans. Her father, Tom Chin, a retired Army colonel with a silver buzz cut and a handshake like a vice, had donated the heavy timber and construction materials from his local mill. "I spent 30 years leading men," Tom had told Jack during the build. "It's about time I helped build something to catch them when they come home." Dr. Marcus Webb had equipped the clinic with surplus gear and his own expertise, while Agent Rita Kozlov, now a fierce advocate for the program in the halls of D.C., had secured a direct line to the Department of Defense's K-9 retirement program. The Second Command was no longer just a thought, it was a reality of cedar, stone, and steel. The first class arrived on a Tuesday, when the morning mist was still clinging to the valley floor. The K-9s were the first to unload from the transport van. There was Aries, a Belgian Malinois with scars from a roadside bomb and eyes that darted with the hypervigilance of a soldier who expected an ambush behind every tree. There was Gunnar, a black Labrador who had lost a hind leg to an IED in Syria, and Dutch, a young German shepherd whose high-drive temperament had made him unfit for civilian life after a traumatic tour in a narcotics unit. Then came the veterans. 5 men and women who walked with the same guarded, heavy steps Jack once had. There was Elias, a young Marine with hollowed-out eyes plagued by night terrors. Sarah, an Army medic who carried the same survivor's guilt Jack knew so well. Marcus, a Navy corpsman with a traumatic brain injury, TBI. And 2 Army Rangers, Jax and Miller, who wore their anger like suits of armor. They stood in the gravel lot, looking at the mountains and the dogs with a mixture of hope and profound skepticism. They were waiting for someone to tell them what to do, yet terrified of being fixed. Nix didn't wait for a command. She stepped off the porch, her limp now barely a hitch in her stride, her tactical collar replaced by a simple leather one. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. She moved toward the new arrivals with a steady, grounding presence that only another soldier could project. She walked straight to Aries, the twitchy Malinois. The 2 dogs stood nose to nose for a long moment, a silent exchange of scent and energy that bypassed human language. Aries's hackles, which had been raised since he left the van, slowly began to flatten. Nix gave a soft, huffing breath and nudged his shoulder, then turned and looked at the humans. "She's the alpha here," Jack said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing as he descended the stairs. "She's the CO. If she says you're safe, you're safe." The veterans watched as Nix moved from dog to dog, then from human to human, leaning her weight against Elias's leg. The young Marine's hand instinctively dropped to her head, his fingers trembling as they buried themselves in her thick fur. Jack gathered the group in the council circle, a ring of flat river stones beneath a canopy of ancient hemlocks. He didn't use a podium. He didn't use a script. He stood among them, his hazel eyes meeting theirs with a transparency that demanded respect. "You came here because service left scars," Jack began, his voice low and steady. "Physical ones, maybe. But the ones that itch in the middle of the night, the ones that make you want to stay in a dark room and never come out, those are the ones we're here for." He paused, glancing at Nix, who was curled at his feet. "So did I. So did she. But there's a lie we tell ourselves when we get hurt. We think we're broken. We think we're surplus. But look at this mountain. It's been burned, it's been frozen, it's been carved by glaciers. It's scarred. But it's not broken. It's the strongest thing in the world." He stepped closer to the young Marine. "Scars don't define us. They are a map of where we've been, but they don't dictate where we're going. Here we don't forget who we were. We honor it. We take the warrior's spirit and we find a new mission. We heal the dogs and the dogs heal us. We find our second command." The first week was a struggle of wills. There were outbursts of anger, long periods of catatonic silence, and dogs that refused to eat. But slowly the rhythm of the mountain took over. Morning hikes turned into training sessions. Shared meals turned into tentative conversations. The breakthrough came on a Friday afternoon. Elias was working with Aries in the tall grass of the meadow. The Malinois had been triggered by the sound of a distant chainsaw, bolting and snapping at the air in a blind panic. Elias had frozen, his own TBI-induced anxiety causing him to spiral into a dissociative state. Jack watched from the lodge, ready to intervene, but Nyx was faster. She ran to them, placing herself directly between the man and the dog. She didn't bark, she simply sat, a solid, unmoving anchor. The sight of her, the dog who had survived the blizzard and the warehouse fire, seemed to pull them both back. Elias dropped to his knees in the grass. He reached out and pulled Aries into a fierce, desperate hug. The dog, usually so guarded, buried his muzzle into Elias's neck. The young Marine began to cry, not a quiet sob, but the gut-wrenching, soul-cleansing release of a man who had finally found someone who understood his pain without a single word being spoken. They sat there for an hour, two warriors shaking in each other's arms, finding a common language in their shared trauma. As evening began to settle over the Cascades, painting the peaks in shades of violet and gold, Sarah Chin climbed the stairs to the porch and sat beside Jack. They watched the veterans and dogs return from the woods, the atmosphere in the camp lighter than it had been since the program started. "You did it, Jack," Sarah said softly, watching Elias walk with Aries, his head finally held high. "You built this for her. For Nyx." Jack watched his partner, the dog who had saved his life by needing him to save hers. He shook his head slowly, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "I built it because of her, Sarah," Jack corrected. "I built it because she reminded me that surviving isn't a betrayal of the ones we lost. It's a responsibility to the ones who are still here. She reminded me that even when you're discarded in a snowbank, you still have a purpose. You just need someone to see it." Nyx trotted up the stairs, her tail wagging slowly. She sat between Jack and Sarah, looking out over the valley they had defended. The second command was more than a facility, it was a living memorial. Every dog that found peace, every veteran who found a reason to wake up the next day, was a tribute to Maria Gonzalez and the team Jack had left behind. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer haunting the shadows. They were the wind in the pines, the sun on the water, and the quiet, steady breath of a dog who finally knew she was home. The brutal whiteouts of winter had long since surrendered to the vibrant, emerald life of a Cascade summer. The air at second command no longer carried the sharp bite of frost. Instead, it was thick with the scent of sun-warmed pine, dry mountain grass, and the distant, cooling spray of the glacial melt. The facility didn't just look complete, it looked alive. The transformation was visible in every corner. The once quiet clearing now hummed with a different kind of energy. It wasn't the frantic adrenaline of the battlefield, but the steady, purposeful work of rebuilding. Under the dappled shade of a massive hemlock grove, Jack sat on a fallen log, leading the evening's group reflection. Around him sat 5 veterans, each with a K9 leaning against their knee or resting its head on their boot. The pairings had become natural, almost biological. Elias, the young Marine, was inseparable from Aries, the Malinois. Sarah, the army medic, had found a gentle anchor in Gunner, the 3-legged lab. Elias cleared his throat, his eyes no longer searching the shadows for ghosts. He looked at Aries, then at the group. "I spent 3 years thinking that surviving that ambush meant I'd failed my brothers," Elias said, his voice scratchy but clear. "I thought my life was a mistake. But Mac's here." He gestured to the Malinois, who looked up at the mention of his nickname. "He showed me that surviving doesn't mean you left them behind. It means you get to carry their memory forward. If I'm okay, then their sacrifice meant something. We're living for the ones who can't." A heavy, respectful silence followed. Jack looked around the circle, seeing heads nod in shared understanding. The survivors' burden hadn't disappeared, but they were finally learning how to carry it together. Later that night, as a blanket of a billion stars draped over the peaks, Jack sat on the cabin porch, the same spot where, months ago, he had arrived with a hollow chest and a loaded pistol. The cabin no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a home. From the mess hall further down the hill, the faint sound of laughter drifted on the breeze, a sound Jack hadn't thought possible in these mountains. Sarah Chin stepped onto the porch, her boots thudding softly on the cedar planks. She handed him a file. "The paperwork is in," she said, leaning against the railing. "We're officially a non-profit. Agent Kozlov pulled some strings in DC to fast-track the certification. We already have a waiting list of 20 veterans and 12 retired K9s. It's growing faster than I expected," Jack admitted. "That's because people need what you have here, Jack," Sarah replied. She paused, then added, "I heard from Kozlov today. The sentencing came down." Jack looked up. Brett Langford got 25 years. No parole. Veronica took a plea deal, 8 years in exchange for turning state's witness against the entire smuggling network. She gave up the buyers, the routes, everything. Her testimony is saving lives before the weapons even hit the street. Jack nodded slowly. Justice was a cold comfort, but it was comfort nonetheless. After Sarah left, Jack felt a warm weight settle against his thigh. Nick sat beside him, her ears twitching at the hoot of a distant owl. Her coat was thick and healthy now, the scars on her ribs hidden beneath layers of groomed fur. Jack reached down and took the chain from around his neck, letting the metal tags clink in his palm. He looked at his own, then at the charred tag that had belonged to SGT Maria Gonzalez. "Maria would be proud of you, Nix," Jack whispered into the darkness. "And I think my unit would finally be proud of me." Nix didn't bark. She simply wagged her tail, a slow rhythmic thump-thump-thump against the wood of the porch. It was the only answer he needed. Sometimes, grace doesn't arrive as a flash of divine intervention or a sudden miracle. Often, it comes in the form of a shivering dog in a snowbank, a choice to act when isolation feels safer, and the courage to believe that broken things can be made whole. Jack Sutherland went to the mountains to disappear, to let the cold swallow the remnants of a man he no longer recognized. Instead he found Nix. And in saving her, he discovered a truth that warriors know but sometimes forget. The greatest battles aren't fought with rifles or steel. They are fought with compassion, with loyalty, and with the stubborn refusal to let evil have the final word. Healing isn't about forgetting the past, it's about building a future that honors it. Jack Sutherland didn't have to stop his truck. He could have stayed in his silence and let the snow cover the truth. But he chose to act. If you believe loyalty deserves respect and sacrifice deserves honor, don't just scroll past. Prove to the algorithm that stories of redemption matter. Like the video, subscribe to join our community of warriors, and comment, "I stand with Nix," to show the world that grace always finds its way. Don't leave them in the snow.